Hi, everyone. If you'd make your way in quickly, I think we're going to try to get started as soon as possible because we have a huge consequential issue and 60 minutes to talk about it. I do have some announcements to make at the beginning of our session. First of all, I have to thank our sponsor, room sponsor, Virtualytics. So thank them. We'll be getting questions from you. INSA staffers will be passing among you, and you can give them questions on 3x5 cards. They'll be brought up here, and I'll try to work them into the proceedings. I was briefly excited because I thought I was going to get continuing education credits for this, but in fact, you are not getting continuing education credits for attending this session. Media may be in the room with us, which is great, so important for an open and democratic society. What's happening after this, you are welcome to join us in the exhibit hall in the Maryland foyer for the networking event. So first, let me briefly introduce myself. I'm Dee Dee Rapp. I'm a former senior person at CIA. Hello, Larry Pfeiffer over there. Did a great deal of many things, including Director for Analysis, Deputy Chief Operating Officer, and winding up as Chief of Staff for the Director. But more importantly, let me briefly introduce our panelists who have graciously agreed to be here today. First is Dr. Evelyn Farkas, who's Executive Director for the McCain Institute at Arizona State. You may have caught some recent TV appearances. In more than 3 decades of service, she's served in legislative, executive branches, private sector, and international organizations, including working with NATO. So she's got interesting perspectives to share with us. Mr. Eric Green was a career diplomat. I guess you still are a career diplomat.
Well, it's ominous.
Also with multiple decades of experience, and his last assignment was at the White House as Senior Director for Russia and Central Asia. He was one of the folks who helped design and implement the strategy going before the war in Ukraine and after it began. He has multiple overseas experience, including twice in Moscow, Eric?
Yep.
Wow. Kyiv, Turkey, Manila. We'll be able to answer a lot of your questions on that sort of info sharing. Next is Luca Capovin, who manages the OSINT force monitoring teams at Janes. He has a warfighter background. He served in the Italian mountain infantry and amphibious infantry, deployed to Bosnia, Lebanon, and 3 times to Afghanistan, and served at the NATO Allied Rapid Reaction Corps headquarters in Birmingham, where he makes his home today. And Dan Hoffman is a former colleague of mine, very senior operations officer, 3 times chief of station, had a very distinguished career leading large human and technology programs, deployed to the former Soviet Union, Europe, and the war zones. He's currently a consultant and media commentator, and you may also have seen him on TV. All right, so we've got, those of you who attended the lunch know we had a healthy dose of Russia-Ukraine. But not to worry, we're going to come at some of the same issues, some other ones from the different perspective, especially that of a practitioner, I think. So, Dr. Farkas, if I could turn to you first, and we'll begin where the lunch discussion began with a reflection on the just completed Vilnius NATO Summit. What are your initial thoughts on the strategic outlook from the decisions made there? Talking about the final communique declaring that Ukraine will be invited to join when allies agree and conditions are met. Do you think this improves Ukraine's strategic position? What are the prospects that all NATO members will ever agree on Ukraine's membership? And what would be the strategic impact of the West's failure to live up to promised military support in a timely fashion?
Okay, so first, thank you, Dee, for the invitation. Thank you to INSA. Thank you to Bishop Garrison. I'm very honored and happy, excited to be on a panel with these very smart and experienced gentlemen, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what they have to say. We are at a really interesting, exciting moment when it comes to the security in Europe and frankly globally, because a lot hinges on what's happening now in Europe in terms of China's response, whether we can deter China. So how we stand up to Vladimir Putin and his threat to the international order will determine much to come. To answer your question, I think that the NATO summit was a resounding success for transatlantic security. It was a success politically because you actually saw all NATO allies completely agreed, so it was a uniform agreement that Ukraine should become a member of NATO. And it is different from 2008 when you had the United States under President Bush, George W. Bush, pushing for Ukraine and Georgia to become members of NATO. And at the time, the German government and the French government were really opposed. And so they just papered it over by saying, one day the Republic of Georgia and Ukraine will become NATO members. This time it was different. I mean, really every ally, except maybe Hungary, because Hungary is so closely allied right now at the highest levels with Vladimir Putin, meaning the prime minister in particular. But leaving that aside, and I think it's fair to leave it aside for the moment, because I don't think the Hungarian people are opposed to Ukraine being in NATO. There was unanimity, and I think that is very important for Ukraine. I do believe that it was a success for Ukraine that they had this consensus coming out of the summit. However, I am one of those people who believes that we should have given Ukraine more. We should have been more specific, and we should have either, I mean, I'm a little bit in the radical camp where I think that there are ways that you could actually invite Ukraine to join now, but leaving that aside because it is riskier than the other options, we should have set a date, we should have set clear conditions, or even one of the two, because Vladimir Putin is going to look for ways to drag out the war. I mean, the only thing that was conclusive was it seems that most allies believe that Ukraine should not become a NATO member while there's a war being waged on Ukrainian sovereign territory. That then leaves a lot of leeway for Vladimir Putin to exercise a veto over Ukraine's ultimate accession to NATO. So I don't like that at all. And I think if we had a date or conditions, and again, the conditions are important because if it's open-ended, then there's too much room for political machinations. What conditions? What are we talking about here? And we eliminated the requirement for MAP, which usually spells out those conditions. So membership action plan, that usually spells out those conditions. So what would the conditions be? And there were vague hints that this has to do with fighting corruption and democratic reforms, which irritates people like me because we've seen other NATO members with not that much better records when it comes to corruption, and I'm not going to name them, who continue to be NATO members, being allowed into NATO previously. So,
and while, by the way, you're fighting to stay alive.
Exactly. So to set the bar that high is ridiculous. And then on the other side of it, and I'll close with this, is that Ukraine is the strongest, largest, most capable, most NATO interoperable, battle-hardened force in Europe today. And then they want to be on our team. So I think we should take them in as soon as we can.
So do you think there will come a day when there will be agreement among the 31, 32 that now the time is right? Or do you think that is just a moving target?
I think that there will come a day, but it leaves too much uncertainty, again, for people like me who worry about giving Russia any kind of opening or any kind of advantage or leaving the question open, given that the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people have earned, I believe, the right to join NATO. It is a little bit too uncertain right now. I do think that they can get into NATO, and so it's all the more reason that we try to do better in terms of providing assistance faster, providing more assistance, providing the longer range Army artillery, the ATACMS, things of that nature. I think we've agreed to provide training for F-16s. Eric can clarify, but I think that that's not quite saying that we're going to provide the F-16s or provide permission to the allies to provide the F-16s. So I think we need to go further and faster. It's not just an issue of winning, it's lives are on the line, and I think we have a moral responsibility to do more for Ukraine faster.
I heard today that the cluster munitions may already be in country, but that the training for the F-16's pilots has been delayed further. May not happen now until next year.
Well, that would be unfortunate in terms of the training. The cluster munitions, it doesn't surprise me because it may be that they were, again, these gentlemen may know, but closer, they were maybe in theater, if you will. And if I could say one thing about the cluster munitions, I think probably this is a sophisticated community where I don't have to explain that much, but I would say we understand the risks. I think the US government understands the risk of providing cluster munitions, but make no mistake, the Russians have been using them all along. And because we don't have sufficient artillery that we can get to the battlefield in time, although again, I would argue for ATACMS and other equipment, it seems that we have a gap. And so it's regrettable. I don't like the decision, you know, but sometimes you have to make a decision you don't like, an accepted decision you don't like.
Thank you from those comments from the Ukrainian perspective. And I'm going to turn to Dan to give us some thinking about what might be going on in Russia, specifically Putin, for whom the war has been a strategic catastrophe from the get-go. NATO is not only held, but it's expanded. Last month, we saw that short-lived insurrection by the Wagner group, and whether you believe it was an attempt to oust Putin or a protest about the way the senior military was handling the war, it's raised questions about Putin's stayability. So what do you think he's feeling these days, and what would you guess would be his next move?
So it's a great question, which I would expect from the CIA's Directorate of Analysis, because I spent decades of my career at CIA trying to see the world through the twisted KGB eyes of Vladimir Putin. And, you know, Russia has, there's a lot of ironies in Russian and Soviet history. The irony in this war is that the KGB operative in the Kremlin, as Fiona Hill likes to call Vladimir Putin, committed massive intelligence failures. I mean, this is the guy who was trained in the KGB, was director of Russia's FSB, the Federal Security Service, the pipe hitters, and responsible for all the counterintelligence operations against us, among others. Vladimir Putin failed accurately to assess the will and the capacity of Ukraine to fight, failed to understand his adversary, Zelensky, who said no thanks when we offered him evacuation. Remember those pithy comments, you know, that he made about the fight's here, I don't need ammunition, take the plane. And Vladimir Putin also failed to understand his own military, that they were totally unprepared to fight, that there was massive levels of corruption and graft over the years, and poor logistics and supply and poor morale. All of those things has contributed to a strategic disaster where Russia has spilled massive amounts of blood and treasure. And where this came to a head is in Bakhmut. And even though many Western military advisors were telling President Zelensky that it would be probably a good idea tactically to retreat, Zelensky and his brave Ukrainian fighters stayed and fought and killed reportedly 20,000 Wagner mercenaries, many of them convicts. What that did was it drove a wedge between Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Russian Ministry of Defense, specifically the Minister of Defense Shoigu and the Army Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov. They'd already been feuding over not working so well in tandem in Syria and in Africa, but this was a spark that drove it to a new place. And for Prigozhin, really an existential threat to his leadership at Wagner, because he took 20,000 of his own guys to slaughter. He's got to blame somebody else for that, and he was right to blame Shoigu and call him out for the fact that Wagner didn't have the military equipment, the supplies that they needed to take the fight to the finish. So there are really profound implications for this Wagner mutiny. Now, Prigozhin, unlike Putin, wasn't trained. He was a hot dog salesman and a convict. He didn't spend time in the KGB or in the military, so don't expect a perfectly rational actor model to apply to his mutinous behavior, if there is such a model. Maybe there is, I don't know. Or maybe the CIA will work one up. But the implications are really quite significant, and there's probably three big ones, at least in my view. First, those very effective Wagner mercenaries are off the battlefield right now. And they were the most effective in Bakhmut. They kept that fight on, and they're off the battlefield. Secondly, Prigozhin, he's not somebody from the Western media or a Western leader. He's a guy who was on the front lines himself, calling out the war for the travesty that it is. And his own guys went into the Rostov military district responsible for operations in Ukraine and took it over without firing a shot. So his Wagner mercenaries and Prigozhin himself had the opportunity to share all that truth with Russian soldiers. And remember, it's all over on Telegram, all the Russians know about this. And however much Vladimir Putin tries to degrade Prigozhin, he's running a big information operation against him, still the truth is out there. And it's out there with a guy who has a lot of sway, in my view at least. So morale among the population, questioning, as Prigozhin did, why are we spilling so much blood and treasure? And the soldiers, why are we still here? Why are we fighting? And then the third implication, longer term, and we've got some people here in the audience who know something about counterintelligence. I'd call you out here in the second row, Dan Payne. Sorry for that, but hey, Vladimir Putin has to vet his own guys now, and it's taken on a rather significant role for him. And he's got questions about his own Ministry of Defense, the Army, Wagner mercenaries. Where do all these people go? Who's loyal to whom? And that is there's an opportunity cost there. If you're doing that, you might not be doing other things. And so we've already seen, there are Russian generals who are being targeted kinetically. We've got the butcher of Armageddon, General Surovikin, who is, according to a Duma representative, taking a rest. That's a euphemism in Russian for probably
Falling out
not.
a window.
Yeah, probably not in such great shape right now, detained. And for some of us who have visited Lefortova prison and seen it in person, as I have, he's probably not the most pleasant circumstances for him. That's what Vladimir Putin's got. Now, here's the bad news for us, because it's never good news for Russia. And I always used to think, and Eric, maybe you feel the same way, between the two of us, we got about a decade in Russia. And as bad as you think it is today, it's just going to get worse tomorrow. And so the bad news for us is that Vladimir Putin is stuck in a bad war, an unprovoked, brutal war of aggression where he has committed massive crimes against humanity. And the more he stays in the war, the weaker his regime security becomes. And the weaker his regime security is, the more he stays in the war. It is a Russian vicious circle, and there is no off-ramp for that I see that doesn't include a lot of chaos and risk with 6,000 nuclear weapons. And we went through this when the Soviet Union collapsed, but back then, General Secretary Gorbachev allowed Boris Yeltsin to exist and even campaign for political power. There is no alternative to Vladimir Putin that we can see. Nor do I think we will, because if that person were to pop his head up, he'd get shot in the face. So maybe Prigozhin is a bit of a canary in the coal mine here. He's living for now because Vladimir Putin knows that to take him out would risk even worse morale and more problems with Wagner mercenaries and his own military, whose loyalty he has to mistrust at the very least. But Russia, I would say right now, presents more of a threat to the region and the world than it arguably ever has, which argues to Evelyn's point about admit Ukraine to NATO. absolutely Ukraine has done more than any NATO member ever has to counter and defend themselves against Russia. They are sacrificing themselves for us to degrade Russia as a military power. And if you look at Russia's relationships in the world with Iran and North Korea and China, that's all a good thing.
So you've indicated that Putin now has to be focused on trying to coup-proof his regime again. What is he going to do in terms of prosecuting the war, would you think?
Well, I think Vladimir Putin wants to demonstrate that he's still very much in control, even though he's not. And so he's going to rely on his closest advisors. There's 3 of them. There's always 3. If anybody speaks Russian, Bog любит Troitsu. The Lord loves the Trinity. They're fond of saying that. So for Vladimir Putin, it's Sergei Shoigu, who's also not a very accomplished military guy, but Vladimir Putin values loyalty over competence, which is showing in the prosecution of this war in Ukraine. So he's got Shoigu, the director of the FSB, Bortnikov, and then his national security advisor, Patrushev. And he's doubling down on his reliance on those 3 to keep him in the Kremlin. And then he needs to demonstrate that he can still take the fight to Ukraine, which is why you're seeing these Iranian drones. And immediately after the failed mutiny attacks in Lviv, that was a message to us as well as Ukrainians that Russia is going to continue to prosecute this war and indiscriminately target the civilian population. So there's, as I said, I don't think there's any off-ramp for Vladimir Putin. He's going to keep firing as long as he has a capability to do it. And to follow up on something Evelyn said, I think what provokes Vladimir Putin, it's not strength, it's not giving Ukraine ATACMS, the long-range artillery, or F-16s or Abrams tanks. It's weakness. That's what provokes Russia. So when you show strength, that's the way to push back on Russia and deter them from doing anything worse. But again, make no mistake, as Vladimir Putin's regime security grows more and more tenuous, the risks to the region and beyond grow. We'll talk about Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. That's a place where things could get pretty ugly.
Eric, let me turn to you. You had an interesting role to play in ensuring that the war got off to a bad start for Putin. You were deeply involved in the effort to declassify, to share with allies information about what Putin was really up to. Do you see a role for a reprise of that kind of campaign in the future? George Barnes from NSA said, you know, this isn't a cookie cutter approach, but could you foresee perhaps in a nuclear context where this might be important? What are some of the lessons learned you took away?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the invitation to join you today. And I think it is important to rewind a little bit and go and think about the situation before the invasion. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the IC for the extraordinary work that they did during that period and since then as well. Think about it. We had 100 days of warning before this war started. And it wasn't just like, hey, oh, something happened warning. We knew battle plan. We knew the vectors of it. All what narratives they were concocting to try to justify it. And the occupation plans as well. I think it's working now. So that was a huge gift to policymakers to have 100 days of time and this rich trove of
This is hybrid warfare here.
I think you might have to push the button right above you.
this one here.
Above your thumb.
Here we go.
Does this better?
No,
No.
Hello? Hello?
that's good.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't prepare my dense mix version of my presentation, so sorry about that. So, so we had all this information, and the goal then wasn't just to like dump out juicy bits of intel in order to embarrass Russia or for some other objective. What we wanted to do then was embed and use this information as part of a strategy to try to prevent the war, deter Russia, build a coalition with European and other allies, and then also to really take the fight to Russia in the information space. So deterrence, as Dan suggested, you know, the goal was to try to persuade Putin that he was misguided about his thoughts about Ukraine, about Ukraine's willingness to fight, about the consequences of an invasion in terms of the response from the West. Obviously, we failed in that because he went ahead with the invasion. Coalition building. We really leaned into intelligence diplomacy, sharing the intelligence that we had with NATO allies, both in large sessions at NATO as well as in capitals, and we tried to tailor those briefings to each individual partner. And we repeated this over the months and weeks because initially they were like, really, what are you talking about? Russia would never be so stupid as to invade Ukraine. But you know, with repetition and detail, we got the allies to at least recognize that this intelligence was clearly flashing red. They had different interpretations of the intelligence, which is fine. But we all agreed, hey, let's assume that we have a possibility of this worst case scenario, and let's plan against that. So that's how we were able to get the allies to really formulate a pretty robust package of sanctions and other measures, force adjustments on the eastern flank as well. And then in addition to this, we also wanted to release some of this intelligence publicly in order to wrong foot Moscow, because we saw, hey, they're going to try to create these false pretexts in order to justify this invasion. They're going to use this disinformation to try to persuade useful idiots in the West to sympathize with Russia's position. And we succeeded in wrong-footing them. And again, there's no cookie cutter here. This was a unique situation in that Russia really wanted to keep this information secret. They wanted the element of surprise. So we denied them that. We also exposed their false narratives before they were able to roll them out. And as a result, I think Russia has not been able to get traction with a lot of these narratives that they've rolled out. Again, they've done a lot of our work for us in the information space by committing horrible atrocities and making it really hard to sympathize with them. So again, there's no kind of formula that you can plug in and say, yes, this will work exactly the same next time. So I would say that you know, we should be thinking about how to use intelligence again for diplomacy, for use in the information space. I think it's important not only to put information and intelligence out there, but also to listen to allies, to understand where they're coming from, and to repeat the process to make sure these messages sink in. And then the other thing would be really to ensure accuracy, and I don't need to preach to you all about the importance of that. given the history of the last 20 or 30 years and some of the scars that we all bear from previous encounters with public disclosures of intelligence. And so we really made sure that when we were actually going to go public with something, we made sure it was completely backed up by the intelligence. And we were very conservative in what we released, and we wanted to make sure that, you know, once the archives are open in 20, 50 years, whenever, people are going to be able to verify, yes, they were on the mark. There was one other lesson, I can't remember it right now. I think I'll just leave it there.
Okay. If it comes back to you, let us know. In the meantime, Luca, you are living and working in the world of open source intelligence now. And we know how important that was at the beginning of the war to track Russian movements. We've seen the war evolve, and lots of lessons to be learned there about the operational adaptations, tactical movements, and so on, particularly from the Russian side. Can you talk about what you've learned about the difference between Russian combat capability and combat effectiveness, things of that nature?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thank you very much. The role of open source. That. Especially at the start. I think it was custom to see shared line from fighting, from spikes of skyscrapers in Kiev, from ships firing long-range missiles from the back. Well, all these are an amazing every combat. And for example, the role of those, especially if you can platform for example, what's the what Russian maximum, maximum a couple of weeks, considering the pockets of resistance. Then we understood that they understood that they couldn't actually achieve their goals. They had to revert to the doctrinal, old Soviet-style fire plans, and it didn't work too, because basically they put the major cities under siege, Kiev, Chernihiv, Kharkiv, and they started to deliver fires randomly on the city. And that didn't degrade any kind of Ukrainian high-value capability. But now they are starting to learn that this approach doesn't work. And basically, since last year, since summer, when there was the Battle of Kherson, we noted, for example, Russian forces building more methodical land targeting plans, not operational level, but tactical levels. We noted that certain units, for example, the 76th Airborne Division, was building targeting plans that roughly look like what also NATO would do, with named area of interest for information collection, target area of interest for effects delivery. They linked and synchronized ISR capabilities with delivery platform, what in NATO is called the sensor-to-shooter coordination, which is an extremely complex procedure that requires synchronization from the planning phase down to the execution phase. And it's something that really is becoming, Russia is becoming proficient in, and it's something that is also contributing to the slow pace of the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Beyond that, let's think also about what the Russians have done to sustain the fight. Russian rear area is sort of a mess, but is a functional mess. So the way they sustain the fight is nowhere near what NATO would do qualitatively. But it's functional. Somehow it works because they created a way dispersed to sustain the fight, replenish the losses to a degree that will allow them to continue fight with a certain degree of effectiveness. And the dispersed mode is allowing them to survive deep targeting by the Ukrainian. And this is also what is contributing, together with the engineering works, for example, to the slow pace of Ukrainians' advance. The third and last point that I wanted to raise about the Russians' adaptation is, of course, all the massive development and building of fortifications in southern Ukraine. Now, we all see that the Ukrainian offensive is not going exactly how most of the NATO partner nations would have expected. And it's also down to the combination of this land targeting process that I talked about of the Russians, combined with a massive, immense, and continuous layering of defenses in southern Ukraine, together with the air-land integration of close air support and air interdiction when they can actually use it.
Thank you. I also wanted to ask what lessons NATO should be taking away from having observed now how the Russians have adapted. And Evelyn, maybe you can comment too, but we are incorporating those lessons into our own future structure, I hope.
Well, absolutely. So understanding what the lessons learned from the Russian armed forces are will surely improve NATO understanding of how they fight and what is going to be implemented and institutionalized across the Russian armed forces in the future, and NATO could act accordingly. Also because paradoxically, now Russia is implementing stuff, for example, the land targeting process and the sensor-to-shooter coordination that have been studied by NATO for decades. NATO used this kind of synchronization and methodology in Afghanistan and Iraq, but of course not with to an extent as it's done by Russia and Ukraine in the current war. Also because basically it's a simple quantitative measure that you can conduct in a high-intensity war, a quantity of missions that you probably would conduct in an entire year or in an entire war in a low-intensity conflict. So surely looking at what Ukraine is doing and what Russia is doing is definitely something that could help NATO understanding what the limitations could be. Something else that could be useful for NATO, for example, is the set of lessons learned that derive from the formidable obstacles that certain terrain features offer. For example, the Dnipro River or the Seversky Donetsk River. In NATO doctrine, of course, things like wide, wet gap crossing, river crossing are part of the methodology, are part of NATO operations. And looking at how Russia conducted this kind of operation, what worked, what failed, what requirement the Russian armed forces should have adopted to conduct this kind of operations is definitely fundamental. Also because, for example, this is one of the things that where NATO could look into, because, for example, river crossing is something that, from the engineering perspective, the Russians did very well, because the Russian engineers were able to build the bridging assets and the ferry assets under fire, and they did it very well. What went wrong for the Russians was the planning of the maneuver assets that would then have exploited this kind of engineering works. So all this kind of stuff are things that definitely NATO should look into and definitely record in its lessons learned.
Thank you. We're starting to get questions from the audience now, so let me turn to some of those. A lot of interest in the Wagner Group episode, so and these are for anyone who wants to jump in. What does that mean for the Wagner Group's activities in Ukraine and its global operations in Syria and Africa? Is it any consolation to Putin that Prigozhin directed his coup at the brass more than at Putin himself? Is he taking solace in that? I don't know. And secondly, also, if we don't see anybody able to challenge Putin at the moment, what do you think are the prospects for another Navalny-like individual to step up and take action?
I can start. Those are all really good questions. And some of them we can't answer right now. It's very dynamic, very much in flux. Reportedly, some of the Wagner mercenaries were held at their base in Syria, and Russian army units were vetting them and ensuring that they couldn't actually leave Syria. And the question of how the Russian army now imposes its control on Wagner, I'm sure, is a key intelligence community requirement. And Prigozhin, remember, has been a guy in our, and as a target for us for a long time. He's under indictment in the United States for interfering in our election in 2016. So there's definitely a lot of interest in him. But he definitely crossed the line. If you listen to Vladimir Putin's speech, I think it was a couple of Saturdays ago in late June, he called what Prigozhin did treacherous and called him a traitor. And there's a really interesting interview of Vladimir Putin by a sycophant Russian journalist who said to Putin, he said, "Hey, it seems like Vladimir Vladimirovich, you could forgive anything." And Putin gives him the KGB look and says, and when the guy asks, is there anything you couldn't forgive? And Putin looks at him with that Vladimir Putin look and says, "Предательство, treachery." So that's just how Vladimir Putin handles his own that way, whether it's polonium-210 with Litvinenko in the UK or a banned Soviet chemical nerve agent like Novichok against Sergei Skripal. He does those things not because those people matter so much in terms of directly threatening him. It's because he has to ensure that his own guys know that he's the most ruthless leader, and so that they don't go ahead and commit mutiny like Prigozhin did. And that is the problem for Vladimir Putin, because Prigozhin is unpunished right now. And so the Tsar, KGB guy, is kind of naked in the Kremlin, and we can all see it. And so how this ends up is a major question, but I don't have the answer for how it ends up. I'm not really quite sure about that. Whether this Prigozhin mutiny was a dress rehearsal for something else, you can bet that just like we're taking lessons tactically from Russia's failures in Ukraine, and China is too, think about, I just have to add to the last comment about that because we have the luxury of time in Ukraine. We're post 500 days into this war. We're not going to get that. If China invades Taiwan, there's going to be a lot less time, and we would do well to pre-position anti-ship and anti-air weapons there, but that's a separate conversation for another day. But make no mistake that China's watching that, and so is Russia. But I can't help but think that as the war goes on, that that's how this is going to end, that someone will remove Vladimir Putin. Now, who that might be, maybe I can drill down on that just a little bit more. When the Soviet Union collapsed, in the 1990s, everything about Russia collapsed. If I'm missing something, Eric, just let me know. But I think pretty much everything, starting with the rule of law. The only piece of Russia that didn't collapse in the 1990s were their intelligence services. And they were running really important cases against us. Rick Ames, the late Robert Hansen, among many others. And so it's no surprise that out of that ash heap rises a KGB guy, Vladimir Putin. What Putin did to Russia in the last 2 decades, in my estimation, is there is no left opposition to Vladimir Putin. In other words, Navalny has no chance. There's no populist left-wing Russian politician, I think, who could supplant Vladimir Putin. And the mass of the population, what Putin has done to them, and it's a natural Russian thing to be apathetic, but that's what they are. And so I see following Vladimir Putin, I'm sorry to say, I don't see it getting any better, and it could quite possibly get a lot worse, which is why some of the contacts that you may be hearing about from senior administration officials, whether it's Director of CIA Burns or others, are so critically important, especially with the director of the SVR, Naryshkin, so that we can maintain these contacts in the event that the balloon goes up again in Russia, and we need to kind of swivel and react to something unforeseen, because I'm not so sure that even our fantastic intelligence community is going to be able to detect who it is that will eventually take over for Vladimir Putin. That's going to be the most guarded secret, because that person or that cabal would be under grave threat if anyone were to know of their existence.
I'm going to try to use that as the segue into this question. What do you think is the biggest information gap we currently have about the conflict today? And everyone, from your own perspective, if you'd weigh in.
I mean, I think we have, in many ways, less information about some of the Ukrainian capabilities and plans, and they've been, they've seen our system as leaky, so oftentimes they withhold information from us. And again, I've been out of government for several months, but I have to think there's more politics happening inside of Ukraine than we may be aware of sitting back here in Washington. So those are kind of, I guess, more high-level political things, but I'm sure there's some things that John would suggest on the more tactical level about the fight on the ground.
Yeah, well, at the tactical level, we can say that we are well covered. We can cover pretty well, both from the open source side, then from the governmental side. The problem is that the operational and strategic level from the Russian side. So the tactical level can be covered. It can be covered quite in a very detailed way, but definitely what sits at the operational level from the Russian side, but also, as you mentioned before, from the Ukrainian side is definitely a gap.
And I would just say, I've been out of government a very long time now, so I can't say what the intelligence gaps are with real certitude, I can say that we had pretty good intelligence at one point in time about the Russian government. But I think today, you now need to understand what's happening among the general officer corps. And that's one piece of this whole Prigozhin episode that we don't fully understand, because he had this kind of, you could become a member of the Wagner Club, which to me just sounds like these generals were getting some kind of kickback, some kind of monetary payment, and that would keep them loyal and useful to Prigozhin. So I think that may be also the crux of the relationship with Surovikin. But so I think those are things that we may not know, but you guys in the intelligence community know better what we know and what we don't know. And I think the loyalties, where the loyalties really lie. The real reason that Putin has been unable to, because I'm sure he is willing, unable to kill Prigozhin, essentially, and destroy Wagner, is because Wagner force is useful to him, right? Certainly the worldwide operations, I think he's probably, doesn't have a plan for how to turn that over to anyone else. And frankly, killing Prigozhin makes him a martyr. And he's feeling out now, how much support he has. And I think what he's realizing is not as much support. So those hardcore nationalists are more likely to support Prigozhin. So it could be dangerous for him to kill Prigozhin.
I'll just add one thing, and from my experience at least, is that Russian intelligence services and the military, they're not monoliths. They are composed of people with different backgrounds and different viewpoints. And so I think following up on what you said about understanding the General Officer Corps, and collecting intelligence on them is super important. And that's why I think, as we all know, the FBI and the CIA put out those videos to recruit Russians. This is, I'm not saying I want to go back to the government or anything, but there's a little bit of nostalgia that might creep in, perhaps, because if you're looking for vulnerable Russian military and intelligence officers, there's a lot of them out there right now who see what Vladimir Putin has done to their country and made them, a resource colony for China and bled the country. 1 million Russians have left in a massive brain drain. That's more than have been mobilized. Aside from the fact that whether they have any moral ethics, that they don't like killing children or kidnapping them and bringing them to Russia and all those other things associated with the war. So this is prime time for the intelligence community to do the work that matters most. When it comes to the Russian target, it's so opaque. Yes, we know that, for example, General Popov was relieved. He's the 58th Army commander. He was relieved. We know that from open source. We're pretty sure. Okay, but there's so much more that is wildly opaque about the country. It's why I liked that as a target, because it matters, and what you read in the newspaper is important, and what you track with overhead reconnaissance and other things that we have today that we didn't have years and years ago that the public can see. But that's where, again, I think the briefings that the intelligence community is giving this administration are just so critically important.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left. I've got 2 sets of questions. One from the military aspect, why the current Ukrainian counteroffensive is going more slowly than before, and what are possible solutions, and an add-on, how has the role of drones contributed to performance on the battlefield?
Well, these 2 questions are basically related, so the answer would be a single one, because let's say that the Ukrainian offensive has not yet started in a way that we could expect from this kind of combat power available. We know that they have between 9 and 13 brigades available, and so far we have only seen sub-tactical level attacks across the front line. So we have seen 3 main axes of advance from the Ukrainian side, one near Orikhiv, one near Velika Novosilka, and one near Bakhmut. However, this could be either probing attacks or deception. If they are deception, we will know it when and if the main effort will be revealed. But at the moment, we have not seen the bulk of the Ukrainian capabilities being employed in the offensive. And that's why, for two reasons. First, because the enemy has the right to vote. And in this case, the Russians did their homework. They prepared for the offensive. They prepared a layered offensive position, minefield, and they used drones to locate through the targeting cycle Ukrainian capabilities, track them through the refinement phase, and strike them with the available fire capabilities during the execution phase. This, together with the minefield and together with the use of multi-domain capabilities, land and air, they are basically making things very hard for the Ukrainians. And after this, the Ukrainians had to make a choice, whether to reinforce what they were doing or try to see if they can do something else. Because a principle of military planning is that you have to fight the enemy, not the plan. If your plan doesn't work, or if the outcome is not what you expected, you need to take the time to review what you were doing. And it's basically what is happening right now. The Ukrainians, yes, have advanced a few kilometers, but it's not nearly enough to achieve what their likely objectives are. And they have not yet reached the core of Russian defenses. They are still fighting along the first line of defense. They have other 3, 4, 5 lines, depending on the axis of advance. So it will be hard for them if they continue to go through that path. There are vulnerable points in Russian defensive line. Partly is due to what Dan said previously. It's due to their endemic incapacity, corruption, and lack of planning proficiency. It's lack of morale in certain cases, especially around Bakhmut. We have observed after the withdrawal of Wagner forces, the introduction of motorized rifle brigades, especially the 57th, which, when attacked even by small Ukrainian forces, tend to break the ranks, to flee without covering each other. We see all the clear signs of low combat effectiveness. And the combat effectiveness is meant as the ability to transform the available capabilities into successful outcomes. And in that case, the Russians there are very vulnerable. But on the other hand, there are also areas of the front line where we have observed significant build-up of forces of the Russians, of the Russian army, especially in Luhansk Oblast, where we expect further attacks in the coming days to divert Ukrainian forces from the south. And same thing, all the more propaganda so far than a real evidence about the redeployment of Wagner forces in Belarus, which could divert further forces of the Ukrainian army to the north, even knowing that Wagner forces do not have the capabilities to take Kiev, for example, from Belarus. Because if you think about that, the entirety of the Wagner capabilities were barely enough to take Bakhmut, and they managed to take Bakhmut after 9 months and losing several tens of thousands of people. So, you know, the opposite of what NATO would call combat effectiveness. So, and about that, what Ukrainian needs, it's far more than cluster munition or squadrons of F-16. To achieve this level of objectives, if you have this level of ambition of driving Russian forces out of the country, you need to invest in a full spectrum of multi-domain capabilities, because it's what they need. And when I say multi-domain, I need everything from land, air, space, cyber, maritime, and both in the cognitive, physical, and virtual domain, because it's how this kind of war-fighting operational planning is done. Achievement of success is directly linked to this kind of capabilities. Also taking always into account that the enemy has also the way that the Russians prepare for it is unfortunately a vital thing to take in consideration. And the more time is taken before these capabilities are available, the more the Russians have time to prepare for this. And it's exactly what we are seeing right now in Ukraine.
Thank you, Gianluca. I think that's our last word, Bishop. Okay, that's a pity because I had a great jump ball question. But thank our panelists here for a good discussion. I hope you got your own questions answered, and thank you.